The violation of human personality is a violation of the most sacred thing which man owns. This order for the mass evacuation of all persons of Japanese descent denies them the right to live. It forces thousands of energetic, law-abiding individuals to exist in miserable psychological conditions and a horrible physical atmosphere. This order limits to almost full extent the creative expressions of those subjected. It kills the desire for a higher life. Hope for the future is exterminated. Human personalities are poisoned. If I were to register and cooperate under these circumstances, I would be giving helpless consent to the denial of practically all of the things which give me incentive to live. I must maintain my Christian principles. I consider it my duty to maintain the democratic standards by which this nation lives. Therefore, I must refuse this order of evacuation.
On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued his Executive Order 9066, empowering the Western Military Command of the United States to designate zones from which targeted groups of civilians could be removed and excluded. This order opened the way for the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast and their incarceration in what Roosevelt had called concentration camps in the American interior for the duration of the war. Since 1979, when the observance of this date was given a name, February 19th has been known among Nikkei, that is Japanese Americans and others, as a day of remembrance. My name is Steve Sumida. I'm on the faculty of the Department of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington, and it is my honor and pleasure to be a moderator for this day's program. First of all, I want to thank and to acknowledge our very generous co-sponsors for the event. Densho, a project of the Japanese American Chamber of Commerce, the Wing Luk Asian Museum, the Northwest Asian American Theater, the University of Washington College of Arts and Sciences, and the Department of American Ethnic Studies, and our principal sponsor, the Walter Chapin Simpson Center for the Humanities, who are the sponsors of this Seattle Forum in the humanities. I want to single out in particular Michael Podlin, Margit Dementi, and Diana Baylor, respectively of the College of Arts and Sciences and the Humanities Center, for their early discussions that initiated this particular program today. Without their support all the way through, this wouldn't have been possible. I wish I could name and single out the many, many individuals in this room right now who deserve individual recognition for the histories that they have made and for the roles that they have played for all of us on behalf of social justice and the health of our communities in Seattle. But when several of us sat down to try to think of the many people who should be recognized, we would spend the rest of the 2 hours naming them, every individual here. We may as well say, let's go around the room and introduce ourselves. So welcome, and thank you very much for coming. I'd like to introduce to you Dean David Hodge of the College of Arts and Sciences. Dean Hodge is a professor of geology. He was recently, before this, the Associate Dean for Computer Technology in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, and now he is Dean of that college. Among the bridges we build and cross today is one linking the community with the university. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Dean David Hodge. In doing so, I wish to speak a fair number of words because a connection between town and gown and the importance of having the university step out into the community is vital to sustaining many values of public education at every level. Listening to him in a meeting during the past year, I learned that Dean Hodge is originally from the Midwest. He is a graduate of Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. and he went on from there to graduate studies at Penn State. Having spent the years from 1990 through 1998 at the University of Michigan, I feel some affinity with Dean Hodge when it comes to thoughts about the histories of Asian Americans in the heartland of the United States. It was in Minnesota that some Nisei members of the Military Intelligence Service began their World War II training in the military Japanese language, just as their white counterparts were doing in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Among the Nisei of the MIS training at Camp Savage and then Fort Snelling, Minnesota, was John Okada, the author of the novel of Seattle, No No Boy. And it was to the cities of the Midwest that many Japanese American internees relocated, some of them never again to reside on the West Coast. Dean Hodge has ways of understanding what such details of our histories mean. We studied together in a Cultural Pluralism Institute one summer at the Evergreen State College in the early 1990s, and he went on from there to begin work on transforming studies and services at the University of Washington to make the best educational use possible out of the new learning in multiculturalism. It is the first time in my career of relocating from one university to another that I enter a situation where my dean already understands about Japanese American studies, Asian Pacific American studies, and American ethnic studies. We don't have to explain from the beginning to him. We don't have to defend and apologize. We are therefore free to try to do the best work we can. I introduce to you Dean David Hodge.
Thanks, Steve. What Steve didn't say was he was one of the instructors in this Cultural Pluralism Institute where we spent 10 days living in the dorms, an intensive study. So what I have learned largely from Steve, and I hope he's taught me well. We'll see. I'm very pleased to be here on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, which is one of the co-sponsors of this event. In addition to recounting many of the very serious consequences of the issuance of Executive Order 9066, we are here today to recognize the impact of the actions of one individual, Gordon Hirabayashi, on all of our lives. I'm honored to be here not only with Gordon, but as I can see in the crowd, many others who face the difficult choices at a profoundly difficult time. Today's presentation is one in a series of year-long events that the college has organized and coordinated, recognizing Gordon's achievements and the events that deeply affected the Japanese American community following World War II. It is especially fitting that the College of Arts and Sciences, home to more than 20,000 students, is a co-sponsor of today's events. As an individual, Gordon made a stand that was grounded in his own principles. College students are typically at an important stage of their lives when they are coming to understand their own values and how those values lead to specific choices that have life-forming and ultimately society-forming consequences. Gordon and those of you, others today, who are here today, who face the consequences of Executive Order 9066, made your choices with dignity and with honor. These choices stand as models to today's students. Gordon's actions forced the U.S. to confront basic issues of social justice and ultimately forced our government to admit that its actions against him and other Japanese Americans were wrong. Not only because they violated the civil rights of Japanese Americans, they violated the civil rights of every American. His actions affect all of us who care deeply about the future of this country. We want our students, and as Steve said, our community to be informed, to be engaged in the larger issues of society, and to care about what happens to others. Highlighting Gordon's story in such a public way is an important moral point of reference for our students, for our community, and beyond. Sadly, the issues of basic human rights and freedoms that Gordon articulated so boldly and thoughtfully now nearly 60 years ago are as important in the world today as they were then. As we know, the past few years have witnessed the terrifying death of millions of people and the loss of civil liberties to millions more because of ethnic hatred. We will have neglected our place in history if we as individuals and a society do not use this occasion and every other occasion to press for basic human rights for everyone. Now, the College of Arts and Sciences, as the core of one of the world's great research universities, is in a special position to highlight Gordon's achievements and to share his story and the story of all Japanese Americans who face the consequences of this executive order. For many years, Gordon has brought honor to the University of Washington by his achievements. It is entirely fitting that this year we recognize him as our distinguished alumnus, because he exemplifies so many of the values that are near and dear to the heart of the college. Many others of you in the audience are also graduates of the university. It gives me great pleasure to observe and to salute your contributions to the intellectual and cultural life of this community as well. Gordon, my deepest thanks to you for sharing this memorable day with all of us. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gail Nomura. I'm also on the faculty of the Department of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington. Today it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Gordon Hirabayashi. With the outbreak of World War II on December 7, 1941, Japanese Americans were subject to many, many restrictions. And with the issuing of Executive Order 9066 by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, Japanese Americans were forcibly rounded up, removed from their homes, and imprisoned in inland concentration camps. The incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II marked the culmination of a century of a racist policy of discrimination and exclusion of Asians in the United States, always considered foreign because of their race. Even the American-born second generation Japanese Americans, the Nisei, were incarcerated in inland concentration camps during the war, along with the immigrant first generation, the Issei, who had been denied naturalization rights based on race. Gordon Hirabayashi was a senior at the University of Washington at the outbreak of war. Born in Seattle, Gordon Hirabayashi was raised in a Christian family that embraced pacifist ideals. He contested, as a matter of conscience, the government's curfew and exclusion orders targeting Japanese Americans on the basis of the government's claim of military necessity, that is, that there was no time to determine who was loyal and who was not. Gordon Hirabayashi was convicted of resisting incarceration, and this conviction was upheld by the United States Supreme Court in a decision that has been called a legal scandal without precedent in the history of American law. It is exactly in times of crisis that Americans expect the United States Constitution to protect them. Yet, in the case of Japanese Americans, the Constitution folded its protective wings, and in so doing jeopardized the civil rights of all Americans. It seemed that no group would be safe in the future if there was another crisis, and they became the acceptable target group. Gordon Hirabayashi was in prison for taking his stand to resist what he considered unconstitutional and immoral orders for the incarceration of Japanese Americans. After the war, he returned to the University of Washington, where he received his BA, master's, and doctorate in sociology. He continued to work for social justice while teaching at various universities. He is currently a professor emeritus at the University of Alberta. In 1981, government documents were found which revealed that the initial recommendations for mass incarceration of Japanese Americans were based on racial considerations, and that in later arguments before the United States Supreme Court, the government knowingly suppressed, altered, concealed, and destroyed evidence, proving that there existed no military necessity for the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. On the basis of this uncovered evidence of government duplicity, Dr. Hirabayashi returned to the courts in 1983, and with a team of lawyers and supporters, won a moral and constitutional victory for all Americans when a federal appeals court in 1987 overturned his wartime conviction due to government misconduct. It had taken over 4 decades for justice to be carried out. This afternoon, Dr. Hirabayashi will reflect on the principles which guided his decision almost 60 years ago to take a stand to resist the curfew and exclusion orders, and in the process, defend the constitutional rights of all Americans. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Hirabayashi.
It's a real pleasure to be here again. It's always homecoming. I use this word, Japanese word for that, furusato, when I was in Japan at my dad's area, because I took the occasion to walk the path he did to the elementary school location and that sort of thing. And to go to a block where they said there's a Hirabayashi home. They didn't tell me there were 11 families located there, all Hirabayashis. And I only had a gift for the main one. So, so although it was homecoming there, it was a kind of reconstructed homecoming. I felt at home there, but it's not like coming back to your real home. All the time I was traveling around, immediately after my degree, while that was drying, in fact, I took off for my first appointment outside of the University of Washington, American University of Beirut. And I didn't realize how significant a decision it was for me to take that opportunity to go someplace to see to what extent the sociology I learned was valuable and general to all parts of the world. That was an area that I heard about, you know, through Sunday schools and that sort of thing. But the picture I got there was that there were others who lived in that area, but the primary population were the Jewish people who were being disturbed. So I went through a real re-education of the authenticity of some of the complaints that come from the other side of the fence on the Arab-Israeli conflict. The conflict is there. In fact, while I was there, a friend of mine, a minister in Spokane, said, there's a group that's planning a trip to the Holy Land. You think it's safe to go there? And I said, are you interested in visiting the Holy Land? He said, yes, I am. I said, well, if you look in biblical history, you'll find that any period there are conflicts there. So if you wait for a conflict to subside, you probably never see it. So he came out, and in fact, even while I was there, I happened to take the week when Eastern Orthodox and the Western Catholic Easter coincided. Every so many years, those dates coincide. And while it's interesting to watch that, it's not an interesting time to be there as a tourist because it's crowded even when it's not coincided. However, for today, the Days of Remembrance, I was part of the first such event which people in Seattle organized. I was here on my final sabbatical leave before I retired. I was going to retire before the next sabbatical, so it was my last sabbatical, and I chose to spend the whole year plus the summer here. And it happened during that time, and the first discussion was, we think we think, you know, nothing on redress was present at that time. This was just remembering what happened in terms of uprooting. And they said, we're going to meet over at the old Six Stadium grounds. That was still there. And we organized, they said, if there are enough people who need rides, we'll have a couple of buses on hand, and the rest of the people could join behind the bus and ride in. They didn't know exactly what kind of turnout there would be. And to our surprise, people kept coming in. And I don't know how many buses had to be reordered or ordered in addition. And the cars that were there, there was a huge caravan that went, and I could just see the surprised people where we turned off of I-5 to the cutoff to Puyallup. People looking like this, you know, the cars going by. It was a wonderful, pleasant surprise for the planners. It seems a little odd that we should use that occasion as, and that right now is February 19, the day the president signed the executive order. We're not celebrating the executive order, but for several years following that, before executive order, we've been having this event, so I think it's an appropriate time. All of these things need remembering and reflecting and refocusing in terms of where we are today in this world. And so when Steve said, you made some kind of statement to the government during the war and refused to participate in some of the government demands. First of all, could we have a copy of that? And then secondly, we'd like you to read that over and reflect on it. What is it now, 60 years? 58 years. Now it's 58 years later. What do you think about that? Do you still feel that way? Is there any modification you want to make to that, or you went through your own personal life experience since then, and you went through court hearings reflecting on various aspects of that situation? A lot of people, your friends and family, lost their lives one way or another during that period. So why don't you reflect on it and then share that with us? And we like to follow through with some discussion afterwards so that there'll be others here who would like to reflect on it too. Well, that seemed like a very appropriate kind of a challenge, because I've been asked a number of times in different circumstances about aspects of my wartime behavior. I remember one when I had to confront it. We've talked about this sort of thing informally a lot of times, but I was teaching a summer session course at the University of Hawaii, and one of the older students, getting on towards my age, this is about 30 years ago, came up and said, I'd like to ask you a few questions. And it's not centrally connected to the course, but to some extent, somewhat. but it really is a question I have. I know about your action during the war, and I want to tell you that I was an 18-year-old high school graduate at the time, and with other 18-year-olds, we were angry at our government for doing this sort of thing. We were kicking rocks and cans and all sorts of things to express that. But all through, and then in the camps and so on, but all through, it never occurred to us that we could have reached out and protested to the right up at the front. How did it occur to you? And that was the first time that question hit me that way. And it was difficult, partly because I didn't face it that way. And so, in reflecting on this opportunity that Steve presented to me, I decided I would just discuss briefly, and Michael, I'm going to have to look at him periodically because he's going to tell me when it's time to close. And I'm not going to have tomorrow to come back to like in a class. And so I've been thinking that I've got to say something with some closure to it within hopefully a half hour. In another discussion related to this year that we're having, when I first came and visited the campus a year ago, on the eve of their telling me that the nominating committee named you as a focus of our celebration for the year 2000. And I just couldn't understand that, because this is alumni. You know, every year, how many do we graduate each year? 7 or 8,000 each year. And this is, you know, way in the past. We're over 100 years old. Think of the number of alumni from which to draw this. It's more difficult than a lottery to have your name come up. And so I just don't understand how it happened. And I know there are people on my committee here planning this year's program who seem to me much more appropriate to be named. They've accomplished a lot. They've been serving the university much more directly over these years. And so I'm grateful for their cooperation and contribution, but and I'm just only now getting a little used to the idea and shifting it towards appreciation rather than embarrassment. But it was one of embarrassment to come to see a lot of people who should be more appropriately named than me for a lot of reasons. So it's that kind of thing. I hope now that they name me, they're going to succeed, and there are all kinds of benefits that could come if, as Dean Hodge says, with the community and the university, increasing contact, lots of rewarding things could happen both ways. And some of that may happen more directly because of this program. I want to focus two kinds of events that gives the seed to some of the queries that this student asked me. How did it occur to you to not to just kick cans, but get out there and protest to the United States itself? And so what I'm going to do is to briefly talk about my home life, where I grew up about 20 miles south of here on a farm, so that as far as farm goes, I had I have difficulty even mowing the lawn. I've rejected that as an occupation. But I appreciate farmers. I always wanted friends as farmers, and but that's the kind of background that I had. And when my father was first learning English with a batch of his high school friends, anticipating coming to the United States, he had a teacher of English who was a very devout disciple of one of the famous Japanese Christian leaders. This leader came into the picture, at the turn of the century, latter part of the 1800s and early part of the 1900s, when missionaries began to go to Japan and so on, and Christianity was bridged in more rapidly through that kind of contact. This fellow, Uchimura Kanzo, father of the so-called NonChurch Movement, Mukul, he said that he's convinced that Christianity has something to contribute to Japan, and it's good, and he is glad that he's stepped in on that, but he wants it to come in ways that fits Japan and in context with the values that already are valued, and not just literally translated from various denominations and so on, and put into action in Japanese language. He wants it to be an authentic life movement. That was Mukyokai. So he rejected denominational approach, and literally, it's not a non-church movement, as some people translate Mukyokai. It's more non-denominational. Don't waste your energy with political battles among each other. Just form the basic things, and also in context with a Japanese way of life that should be recognized, and then fit it in where it really can be useful. And so I don't know how much English he learned. Not very much in the way of oral. I don't think this teacher ever heard an oral speaking Englishman or American. And so you can just imagine the translation. My mother said the oral part of the teaching was useless. Nobody understood them. But he taught about the kind of culture it was and so on, and gave a lot of useful, valuable background for preparation to go to an unknown area. This ended up with some questions as to how effective the English was, but he persuaded him to become a member of this movement, which is something that I think had a factor in the development into my life. I was regretting until about a year and a half ago, that I missed the golden opportunity to really learn something about how my father explained and expressed his religion that was meaningful to him, and how this teacher, as a religious leader, in his other role as a religious leader, what kind of impact he had to his life. I was attending a conference in Kyoto on interrelations, particularly English-Japanese contact through this university, Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, and University of British Columbia in Vancouver, UBC. I'm not from there, but they branched out to invite others from Canada to participate in the conference, particularly since one of the main speakers was a retired professor whose specialty was early Japanese Christian leaders. And one of the leaders that he was going to speak on was Uchimura Kanzo and the Mukul-kai, the so-called non-church movement. And so this person was delighted to hear that a Nisei, a second generation of Uchimura Kanzo's church, my dad's son, is going to be in that conference, so he was looking forward to seeing me. And I was curious to listen to him because I thought I lost, you know, as I grew up, like many of you here in the audience experienced similarly, I spoke only Japanese till, you know, in this farm community until I started first grade. And I was one of the early Niseis, so there weren't a lot of English-speaking people around. When I started school, I began to learn English. And some of my neighbors were doing the same thing. And so the playground was a mix of Japanese and English. I should have picked up half a dozen little phrases that comes out very humorous to us. You know, they have the subject matter and then they use the Japanese word here and then end up with an English conclusion. But it seems very, very interethnic relations, you know, in that sense. But I thought I began to lose, that was the beginning of my losing of meaningful contact intellectually and spiritually with my father, because as I learned English, increasingly as I grew up, matured, I was losing my Japanese because I wasn't using it as much, and I wasn't at home in the latter stages of my education. And my father never had a chance to talk, you know, like for example, when he gives a prayer, I don't know what he's saying for half of the time because the vocabulary is beyond me. And I knew, you know, he wouldn't understand anything that I said. Well, largely he wouldn't for most of the English that I would use. So I thought, unfortunately, for that kind of process, we've cut each other out of some of the most important central things. But listening to this history professor, retired history professor, talk about Uchimura Kanzo and his movement, and then branching off to an American branch that started in Seattle area, in the university area, 65th Street, near Sandpoint, that used to be called Pontiac. And so he had this old early history village name, the Pontiac movement. He said the Hotaka Club. That's the village from where Dad came, where there's a lot of the young people that came in with this same teacher, and many of them had been converted along with Dad. And they were following this system, Mukul Chi, resisting offers from the various Seattle and Tacoma regular churches, Methodist, Japanese Methodist, Japanese Congregational, Episcopal, and so on, other churches. When I began to notice that he didn't have some accurate interpretation of some things just on the factual parts, I thought, boy, if I had a little more Japanese, I could talk with this professor and fill in some of the cracks, and then I could learn from him more of the kinds of basic philosophy underlying the Mukyokai movement. Then I discovered a book on coming back, a book that, in fact, was in my library. I had gotten it from a professor I had hired, and in recalling some of the factors that led me to invite this person to come to the University of Alberta. See, he visited just by chance. He was finishing his PhD. He was not Japanese ancestry. He was an Italian church person, Catholic church person, who went on as a kind of a missionary journey to Japan from Italy with possessing a licence or license as his degree. And when he got to California, he started to pick on the general topic of Christianity in Japan, and decided that one of the central issues were most demonstrated by the movement, Mukyokai movement, is a cross-cultural thing as well as just translations of a new faith to Japan. He did quite a bit of work in discussing the church, the values, and the reason why he was pushing this, Uchimura Kanzo, why he was doing this. And it was for those reasons I was too busy with my work to read fully, and I wasn't all that curious to fill in the gap, I guess, between my father's inner feelings and my inner feelings, and how we're missing the boat. But after this conference, I reflected a lot, and I got a hold of this book and started reading what this person did for his PhD dissertation. I'm in it now, I haven't finished it yet. I'm realizing that there were a lot of things I was overlooking in my relationship with Dad and understanding each other. Although there was this language barrier, in terms of something like faith, the meaning of the faith, I'm there as an observer for 20 years or more, day to day, as he confronted difficulties with the neighborhood or with business. You know, we went through depressions and other kinds of difficulties. And this Christian co-op farm, headed by Sho Ichiro Katsuno, who was our neighbor, he recruited Dad and his bunch to join him on a 40-acre farm. And they said we could do the farm as well as have our religious community too. And I was watching this, and I began to see that in some aspects of understanding the value of faith is to see some of the discussions and the practice that emanated from it. I see that daily, see, in interpersonal relations as well as on serious community and this religious farm problems. So on that basis, I was already beginning to put together insights that were available in various ways which I was not recognizing until this kind of focus. So I'm in the process of getting a refreshed new insight, and speaking a little bit with my younger brothers, I was not the firstborn, but I was secondborn, but my firstborn brother died when he was 5, and I was only 2, so I don't recall him at all. But since he passed away, my parents just simply regarded me as firstborn. And I said, well, it doesn't, you could think of me as firstborn, but don't treat me like a Japanese firstborn, because we look at things differently. You know, the firstborn is like the crown prince. For better or worse, he inherits everything the father has, and it's up to him what he shares. I said, if anything happens to you, I'm going to have a discussion with my 3 brothers and a sister, and it'll be 20% each, if, you know, as far as economic questions go. And I can't do it in any other way. I'm not comfortable in any other way. And but he just treated me as Chonan, first son. When I'd come back after I came to Canada, I used to see him regularly on the way to conferences or on the way to someplace or other. And he would, my discussion with him is a summary of the different kinds of issues, family issues that he wants to discuss with me. I said, why don't you take that up with the younger brother here and the sister? No, this is for you. And he always, he in fact groomed me as a first son by his treatment of me, and refusing to deviate from it. And it was convenient for my brothers to some extent, because they didn't feel responsible, and they said, well, you take it. If there's something I could do, let me know, and they would depart. When Dad had a serious operation, we all gathered, and then various one says, gee, I have to get home because of this or that, and I had to go home too, but I couldn't say that and leave, knowing that after I left, only my sister would be here. And so he treated me in such a way that I wouldn't be comfortable if I did that. Well, getting back to understanding of his faith, even without the language, in fact, maybe because language did not interfere. When we study religious groups and impact of religions and various other things, we look, at least in part of the study, the core set of faith that this group stands for. And then we look for the practices that emanates from that as the human interpretation of this faith. Well, that was available to me. I'm seeing it in terms of Dad, in whatever his faith is. I know how he responded to issues consistently. And I never saw a fellow followed principles that closely, you know, to his own economic disadvantage. So I think there's something there if you want to reflect. When the pressure came on, even when I became, for a while, seemingly alone, I didn't feel comfortable in changing. People said, how'd you stick to it? Well, I just didn't have an alternative. No, that's one reason you stick, because you don't know which else way you should go. So that's the kind of bearing I had, and in different kinds of illustrations, this could be carried out to show that I did have a pretty good picture of Dad's faith in practice. And then I'm reading this book now, and I could say how that could be described in religious context by this, my colleague's dissertation. You know, he taught at, he began to teach at Sophia University that had English classes, as well as he was learning Japanese, so he had the ability to reinforce it with some Japanese that he had. And my other colleague, a specialist in Japanese history, she got her PhD at Michigan in Japanese studies, but she got her groundwork, her legs, as being part of the occupation force. And that gave her the expertise, and she told me, you know, she's a Native American, she said, I talked with Dr. Calderola in Japanese because I can understand him. I don't understand his English so well, but I could understand his Japanese, and we communicate that way. Well, that's the sort of a background that gives me the situation that covers that part of the background. And I want to briefly mention the other thing, and then perhaps some questions could help to explain the other part. One thing I went through that people of my age went through, those later, you'll have to imagine it. Living through the 1930s, probably the most widely, deeply impacted depression, social impacted depression we've ever had. Everything, it affected every institution of our lives. And we had a whole society living for a long time on freight trains and that sort of thing. That was followed immediately by the 5 years of the most total war that we had ever been in society, World War II. Those who lived through those two experiences, whether you're in camp or not, you had experiences that are really deep and affected you in different ways of life, different aspects of life. And so that's another part of the picture, and the part of the picture that when I ran into certain issues, I had that first part affecting me, the inner core, Dad's way of persisting in his faith by not changing his practice, even if there were conflicts. And so I had a model I was following which I didn't realize. And I think that's part of the explanation that you could have, and then we can verify it later in certain other ways. So when issues, in conclusion, I was not one of those angry rebels looking for a cause. I was one of those who tried to make sense out of some principle or some faith aspect, and if a challenge came, I wanted some explanation. And so it came to my attention that, for example, if you're interested in national security, there are a lot of ways of looking this up and taking measures. Looking at somebody's ancestry, well, in our criminal law, we know that that is not a factor that's legally valid evidence. Even if both parents were criminals, it does not indicate that you will be by ancestry, by other factors maybe, but not by ancestry. So that's the sort of thing that didn't bother me at all. But when the first movement took place, I was really surprised that there weren't more people. Just out of people who would recognize that as an awful thing to happen. In fact, a lot of people went through the uprooting experience saying, it can't happen here. We're a democracy. It can't happen here. And walking in behind barbed wires. And me behind bars. It can't happen. This isn't America. But wartime does a lot of peculiar things. Hysteria was strong, and the commission report verifies that. They said it wasn't due to military factors, all of this, but war hysteria, racial prejudice, and lack of civilian leadership. Those were the things that led to U.S. doing some unprecedented things like redress. Very few countries have done that. Canada did it. Canada and U.S. are unusual in that respect. To say some years later, 40 years later, we made a mistake. We're sorry. They can't do too much about it, but they did what they could. And when we were doing the redress movement, one difficulty was, should there be money involved? And there was a large number said, we don't want the money involved because they'll think we had our hands in the till and so on. But our system of justice has money involved. The more serious the crime, the heavier the fine, in the fine part, and the longer the sentence. So that if no money is involved, or just $1,000 are involved, they'll say, well, I guess they recognized there was some error, but I guess it wasn't very serious for just $1,000. So we felt that money was a part of the issue. How much? At what point? Well, those of you who were in that discussion know how difficult that question was. And we had all kinds of illustrations like, well, if you had $2,000 in the bank in 1940, 40 years later, with inflation and interest and all that sort of thing, how much would it become? And some people said that would come out to several $1,000s. And one of them said that'll a figure like 25,000 would easily come out of a certain amount of modest savings over that period of time. So it wasn't that we needed money in a grab bag sense, but in a justice sense. It needed to be a part of the picture. So all of those things weren't decided in detail. I didn't have those understandings in detail on the steps that I took. I just took the steps that I needed to take or I had to take. I was obeying curfew until one day dashing back, and my non-Japanese ancestry roommates would be telling me, hey, it's 5 to 8. They're still at the library, and I was dashing back one day, and it's, how come I'm dashing back and my roommate's not? With what I believed, I couldn't accept curfew, but I was doing it until then. Uprooting is much worse than curfew, but I was expecting to catch the last bus 2 days before that happened. University District was the last district, and the last bus 2 days from now would find me on it. That's what I thought, until another question emerged. If you couldn't accept curfew, how can you accept this thing? That's what you're doing if you go. Well, then I just couldn't go. It's not that I had a whole lot of crowd behavior behind me helping me to do it. I didn't have any other way to act and still maintain at least my feeling of self-respect. And so I think I'll end at that place, because this is an issue that is constantly going. Our community has all kinds of issues that are difficult to resolve, but we try to face them and meet it to the best we can, and by recognizing the sincerity, integrity of the people pressing the various viewpoints, I think we get a better understanding of community. Thank you.
We do want to ask Gordon to please come up here and read the statement in question. His 1942 statement, which informally called "Why I'm Taking This Stand." And I must say that perhaps, Gordon can tell us, but perhaps no other audience has ever heard him read this, unless it was a policeman or FBI official, something like that. And you know, too, that it was confiscated from him, so he only finds it written up or excerpted in books that he reads about him. He doesn't have a copy himself. This comes from what he sent us because we put him on a spot when we asked for the statement, because he didn't have a copy and he found it in a book.
I think I'll read this, but when he asked for a copy, I said, I know I have a copy somewhere, but right now, especially, I just moved and I'm not unpacked yet fully. And I'm looking for a lot of things. I hope they're in some boxes. But this, I said, it ought to be easy. When I talked to him, I said, it ought to be easy. First place I looked at Michi Wegland, because I've talked with her long hours and intimately exchanged ideas and so on, and she told me there are all sorts of other things that she found of my statements in the archives, federal archives. So I said, this should be in there. Well, her book on, what's the title? Days of Infamy. Years of Infamy. It refers to this and gives a half-sentence theme of it, but it doesn't say it. So I couldn't give him the quote until this one by Anne Replug Fisher, Exile of a Race. And she was at my trial, so she heard it then, and she was one of these professional stenographers, so she must have got it there, or she must have gotten somebody else's statement. I passed around a few copies at the university for those who were interested and supportive, including the board of directors, chairman of the board of directors of the University of Washington YMCA, because I was staying in their dormitory. I wanted him to be informed what I'm going to be doing. And he happened to be Colonel Kimmel, the head of the ROTC on the campus. And I think when I handed this statement to the FBI, I was in the FBI office because I didn't want the YMCA to be accused of harboring a dangerous criminal and so on. And I had given this, and he said, oh, we already have your statement. I said, well, this one is for you anyhow, so take it. I gave it to him. I should have saved it for Steve. I was figuring out who among the half a dozen might have given it to the government. And since I was preparing it for them, it didn't matter. And I think it was this person, because I think Colonel Kimmel, who was very warm to me, and his wife was always delighted to see me, and I was delighted to go to a board meeting with meal, you know, good home banquet meal, and she frequently had meetings of the board at her home. Colonel Kimmel respected me as an individual. He knew by that time that I was a conscientious objector, but that didn't make any difference. And I think his military professional training required him to, you know, this is a statement that should get into the FBI hands. I may be wrong, but I think that's what happened. This is statements. I've heard also that I wrote it said a 4-page statement or something, or longer. It was only about a page and a half at the longest, and this one that she quoted in discussion of the trial that she was reporting on, the first trial in 1942. Why I'm taking this stand. The violation of human personality is a violation of the most sacred thing which man owns. This order for the mass evacuation of all persons of Japanese descent denies them the right to live. It forces thousands of energetic, law-abiding individuals to exist in miserable psychological conditions and a horrible physical atmosphere. This order limits to almost full extent the creative expressions of those subjected. It kills the desire for a higher life. Hope for the future is exterminated. Human personalities are poisoned. If I were to register and cooperate under these circumstances, I would be giving helpless consent to the denial of practically all of the things which give me incentive to live. I must maintain my Christian principles. I consider it my duty to maintain the democratic standards for which this nation lives. Therefore, I must refuse this order of evacuation. Now today, just on the language basis, I would change some things because I've learned to speak on these criminal type issues in more legal terms. So I would not include certain Christian or religious principles or expressed in those terminologies unless it was asked of me. Secondly, I would not use, I've used it twice here, evacuation. The word evacuation. During the war, the government did a major coup in public relations with clever euphemisms for horrible things. Evacuation is a humanitarian term for earthquake, fire, other kinds of disasters for the benefit of the victims. That's not what this process was, so it's not accurate. And I wouldn't use that, but we get used to it, and when I tried to get some of my friends who use it, they said, we can't drop it. It's part of our language. Like, we evacuees, or we evacuated, it's in as not only noun, but as a subject, adjective, verb, all sorts of things. And they said, if we try to explain that without using the word evacuation, we have to have about another paragraph to show what it was that we were involved in. So they have us trapped in many ways, but a chemist, professional chemist, Raymond Okamura of the Bay Area originally, I don't know where he lives now, but he brought out a comparison of what the Nazi Germans called their places and what the US called their places, and they're very similar things. The current Germans don't use the Nazi German terms. Our government still uses it because it's the same government. And in fact, the victims still use it. At least some of us try to go straight in the language and not continue the euphemisms. So I would make those different, but the basic principles, I think I still stand for them, and I still do what I can to uphold them. In answer, final answer to your question, at this stage, there is not much change except maybe strategy or more maturity about what the implications are. I didn't know where I was going to go, firing squad or what, you know. But even if it's firing squad, I knew some of the guys who volunteered and actually did get shot on the front lines. They gave their life. I thought I should be prepared to give my life when called for. So I didn't think it was any different than any other kind of requirement. So that's that part of the question. Oh.
No, you can keep it. I made plenty for you and me in large font. Okay. I'm going to cut short my transition here to the discussion period. I hope it ends up being short. We try to script everything as much as possible in the interest of being on time. But obviously we appreciate the kind of tone that Gordon himself sets. And I do want to mention that yesterday we did ask him which he feels comfortable being called, Dr. Hirabayashi, Professor Hirabayashi, or Gordon, and he said Gordon right off, because many people here in this room have known him for so long that, you know, like that word you just mentioned, it would be very difficult to change one's vocabulary to call you Dr. Hirabayashi at this point. So thanks, Gordon, for your remarks, and we will soon have an open public discussion about any aspect of what you talked about, or for that matter, what people want to contribute to this Day of Remembrance. Because it wouldn't be much of a day of remembrance, if you ask me, if it were just about one single individual and we thought of this as being an individual matter. It has to do with the entire community, or as Gail pointed out in her introduction, has to do with civil liberties, social justice for the entire country. And this, of course, has worldwide significance in itself. Gordon had suggested, oh, first of all, I should say that the idea of asking Gordon to respond to his 1942 statement came from Professor Tetsuden Kashima, who is our colleague in American Ethnic Studies. He is not here today because he is on leave during this quarter and could not be here. But it was his idea. I thought it was a really good idea, and that's why almost immediately, I think, I called Michael first to run it by him, and then I called you, Gordon, to see what you thought of that idea. So I do want to acknowledge him. The second part of that idea was that we get a couple of respondents, formal respondents. One would be Gordon's contemporary, someone in a community who would want to follow Gordon, who had also experienced that crisis in their lives in 1941, 1942, and thereafter. Secondly, I wanted to find somebody in the college age range, from 18 to 21. Gordon himself was 23 when he wrote that statement, but I wanted to have some comment by someone who, looking at the statement, looking at Gordon's actions, would be able to say something about how one would respond today, how a person feels about seeing, kind of what we see as a heroic act like this, and how could a 23-year-old do this in our lives today. Well, we failed at finding respondents. And by we, I mean mainly Charlene Mano and myself. Charlene was a coordinator for this program up at the Wing Loop Museum. We failed, not because we couldn't find people, actually, because dozens of people in this community would fit either of these descriptions. But we failed because actually our plans changed. Our plans changed because of responses we did hear from people we asked. One gentleman in particular spoke about how back in 1942, everyone in the Japanese American community, after all, had to make choices, had to make very hard decisions. It wasn't just a matter of following curfew orders or following evacuation, so to speak, orders, but it was a matter of having to decide about how one was going to respond to these orders. And so the advice we got was that we should really open this up to hear other people talk about the kinds of decisions they have had to make, and as well as people who want to inquire about such the making of such these momentous decisions in one's life. Well, it happened that in the past couple of weeks, as people in my graduate seminar in Asian American literature know, we've been moving along to read a book called Fault Lines by Mina Alexander, a South Asian American writer. And Fault Lines is a memoir, her young life, but in many different places in India as well as in Africa. And in one of her statements in the middle of the book, she mentions the kind of intellectual and spiritual legacy that she grew up within. Just as Gordon is speaking right now about the legacy of Uchimura Kanzo and his followers, the teachers who came from him, and as well, your father. Mina Alexander writes that Lev Tolstoy, that is Leo Tolstoy, had spoken with Rabindranath Tagore, who was another great idealist of that time. And both of these, in turn, had gone on to be of great support, that is to say, by the kind of predecessors they were, to Gandhi. And this statement right there clicked for me, because I was thinking then of the member of our community who said that everybody had to make very difficult choices. And I was thinking about Gordon's case as well. And I was thinking very much about Gordon's great idealism. And these people, Mina Alexander names, would be in this kind of tradition too. So what I remembered was something from, let's say, David Hodge in my time, when in the Vietnam War time, we had to think about such things as well. 30 years ago in my English composition class, I would often use a letter by Leo Tolstoy called, at the time, Letter to a Draftee. A young German man had asked for advice from Tolstoy in the late 19th century. What should I do when I'm faced with military conscription in Germany? And Tolstoy answered. He said, there's a time in every man's life when you're faced with having to make a very hard decision. It is a situation of being on a sinking ship and deciding whether to save yourself or to save others. It is a situation of being in a burning house. And in our time, there is no other situation that is commonly experienced like this but the experience of facing the military draft. Now, I emphasize that Tolstoy never said you must decide this way or that way. Although most people, I suppose, jump to the conclusion that Tolstoy was telling this young man, because you are going to do the right thing, you must refuse the draft. But Tolstoy does not say. He leaves it to that draftee. And this, to me, is what resulted from our inquiries among people about how we should follow Gordon's talk with a discussion today. And what I'm talking about is giving people the opportunity to ask about and to talk about the kinds of decisions that had to be made in regard to this, or for that matter, parallel and related crises. And I also wanted to invite, of course, people like myself, born after the war, young people who may want to say something about how it is to look at one's life today and to see what kind of relevance there is to life today, relevance of Gordon's act, Gordon's decisions and Gordon's acts. And in this regard, I would like to emphasize that after all, we may think that, well, back in the old days, all of these big events happened, and these things don't happen today. History is always made in the past. I just wanted to emphasize that I think that history is made right now. Sure, please.
You want to written out, is that right?
No, go ahead. Okay. Can you say who you are?
Okay. My name is Mark O'Doy. I live in Renton. The question I like to ask to Gordon Hirabayashi, who I knew a little bit back at the University of Washington before the war, but I'd like to ask him, one, how does he feel about the Japanese Americans who answered no to the loyalty question and serving in the Army, and of the Japanese Americans who refused induction into the Army?
I'd like to comment on a similar situation first as another angle to this. At the time I was at the University of Washington dormitory, my room rent was paid by being the heating man. I took care of the furnace off and on and change and that sort of thing. And I had a room right off the gym and an extra bunk. And one of my Nisei friends was complaining about, having to go back and missing some of the events that took place at Eagleson Hall, where I was living, and so on. And I said, well, I got an extra bunk there. If you want to stay, come in and just go home for the weekend, and you can stay here. So he did that. And then when he, in the course of various discussion, found out that I was about to not get on that last bus, he said, I feel the same way as you do. I agree with your arguments and so on. And he said, I said, well, you owe it to your parents at least to explain it face to face. And if you really feel that way, you can ask me more questions, and I'll answer to the extent I can. But you have to answer your situation. I'm doing the same for me. And so he went home, came back very disturbed. His father, Bill's father, was 10 years older than mine. he was the only son or the only child in the family, and they said, "You got to help us. We don't know what's going to happen to us, and we were counting on you to be, you know, with us, not only physically but morally and so on. And then if you're going to do something like that, we don't know what's going to happen to you and so on." And I said, you know, I want to tell you, I'm more fortunate on that aspect. There are 5 members in our family, 4 boys and a girl. One of them is already graduated high school. He's working at home right now since school didn't seem to be able to allow people to finish up in a year. So and I had a 10th grade brother, and then one in elementary school. And my dad was 10 years younger. And I said, the physical needs are taken care of. I don't have to be there. So I was relieved of that part of social responsibility. And so I said, you have to face this, and what your family is asking is a real important question. And if you're coming with me, we don't know where we're going to go, and you don't know what crises we're going to face. I'd like you to think about this carefully. In the worst scenario, before you come to an answer. And I said, if for any reason you can't find a good answer for your parents, go to them and say, I still am uncomfortable, but I see what you mean, and I'm going to do what I can, being with you in this situation. He eventually agreed with that position and stayed on. And I used to correspond with him from Oberlin and that sort of thing. In answer to your question, the no-no boys, I would say the same thing. If that was their sincere position, I mean, I respect it like anybody else's sincere position. And I hope others respect mine, even if their conclusions are different. In May, in one of the university programs, there's going to be what's the general theme of the Nikkei experience in the Northwest. One of the papers that's going to be presented is by my anthropology brothers. He was the one that was a sophomore in high school at the time of the war. He's now a retired, in fact, the chief curator of the National Japanese American Museum at Los Angeles on a half-time basis, but he lives at Mill Valley in California. And he's presenting a paper on what he called 4 cousins confronting the same issue. And he's picked 4 of our relatives, including me, and what I did. Another one who was in MIS. He's the one that whose parents sent him to Japan, and he came back and was very valuable to the U.S. counterintelligence for his bilingual skills. And he was on the Burma Road and that sort of thing. Another one is a cousin whose sister I'm staying with on this trip, Lillian Yamamoto. Bob Mizukami ended up for a short stint being mayor of Tacoma. He was alderman for a couple of terms and then was mayor for a term or so. He was a part of the 442nd. And he went with his younger brother a year about a year younger. They were fairly close in age. The two of them volunteered together, and he's buried in Italy. And the fourth one was another person who lives in Seattle, who was devastated to discover that his father was arrested right after Pearl Harbor, because U.S. FBI and so on went after community leaders. This person's father was several times president of the Japanese Grocers Association. He was very good at handling social events and so on, and organizational things. And see, all the community leaders, if you wanted somebody who had a good network and who could organize things as an assistant to you, from the Japanese military intelligence purposes, if they wanted somebody from the community, you would want the community leaders. They're the most potentially useful one. Well, he was picked up, and the devastation this boy went through. He was he was about first year university age. He had graduated the year before. He wasn't going to university. And he had to look all over, eventually found his father maintained at the immigration building, immigration office. And so he went over to visit, and of course the father had to go through a couple of barred doors before he came to the place where he could talk. And he just couldn't take it. And also embittered. And so out of all of this, in addition to just looking at the injustice of the thing, he took equivalent to a no-no position. My own position was not necessarily on 27 and 28, but I asked my draft board, you sent me two forms, one a big fat one on the selective service questionnaire, and the second one was the 30, was it 30 questions or so, 28 or 30 questions that were asked on the loyalty as they saw it. And I asked, I said, the big selective service questionnaire, you didn't look in the files. You got not only that, but my appeal for conscientious objector status, my hearing, and your draft board's approval of a change of status from 1A to 4E. And so I don't feel it's of any value to fill in another form. And secondly, I said, this one, does every draftee potential get a loyalty questionnaire, all ancestry, or only to those of Japanese ancestry are you sending this kind of questionnaire? I never got an answer for 3 weeks. In the meantime, I had checked with the Spokane draft board. I said, you still drafting people? He says, yes. I said, what do you send them? He said, well, the questionnaire. You got a loyalty questionnaire you can send them? He says, no, we don't have anything like that. Are you up to date? He says, yes. This, nothing like that has come in as an order, so that's it. So I figured 3 weeks was sufficient time for them to answer me. I never got an answer, so I returned my two forms with a cover letter explaining what I had done and what my views were, and that I could not fill it in. I could not fill the second one in because I didn't feel that it was constitutional or democratic to ask this only of one group on the basis of ancestry. I wasn't a no-no in the sense, I was a no for all of those. But recently, those of you who read the Pacific Citizen have read that one of the former road camps, federal road camps, minimum custody road camp outside of Tucson, Arizona, decided to name their former prison grounds as Gordon Hirabayashi Recreation Center. When they asked me that, I said, well, I appreciate your asking me. When they said, would you object to being named for a former prison? I said, no, I don't object to that. I feel that you're honoring the greatest source of manpower that came from the prison. They supplied all the manpower over about 3 decades before they reached the top. And now that highway, incidentally, is about half hour out of Tucson. They tell me it's the busiest highway in Arizona except for the road between Phoenix and Tucson. Other than that, this is the busiest highway. And I said, well, if the prison authorities were doing this, they'd probably name it for some prison superintendent or something. So I appreciate your recognizing the prisoners and their contribution. But you should think of somebody else that spent a little longer. I only was there 90 days. Some of them were there for over 2 years, risking their lives for, you see it's a very spectacular highway. In places, if you think about what the builders and workers had to go through, some of it were very dangerous physically, things could have happened. I haven't heard of any accidents where prisoners lost their lives, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of them did on the job. But November 8th, they had a naming ceremony. When they picked that date because, and they asked me if I'm free to come, and they said, we found that on that day there's at least 1, maybe 2 members of U.S. Senate or Congress that are back in the home office and could participate in the naming ceremony, and so on. And this is the U.S. Forest Service that's doing this. They own the land, and they loaned the land at the prison request for a road camp until they reached the top. And then the prison details were removed, the buildings and all those things were removed. It was a fairly large complex that housed about 200 prisoners, plus the administrative staff that were needed to maintain that office and security and so on. And so quite a bit was done there, and all they could do now was to reestablish, the first thing is public service system, the toilets and so on. It's mountains, so you have to follow geological information and techniques. But the point is, they wanted an opportunity to say that among the people who contributed to this highway were groups of people, including Japanese Americans who were uprooted during the war, and there were a group from not Topaz, but Grenada, who came in from Colorado in chains, like a chain gang, leg chains. They did what they were told. Here's people who were in enemy camps they're going to be coming, so they had them in chains to be safe. But once they got in and got acquainted, they had no chains, no barbed wires, no nothing. It was an honor camp. And, and some of those people, or groups of Jehovah's Witnesses, Hopi Indians, who were people who said, we're not conscientious objectors to all wars, but we have no interest in fighting your European enemies. If it were fighting for our liberty or something, we might serve. And so they were a special form of objectors. One of those could have been named, or, you know, it's that kind of situation. So I was a little bit embarrassed talking to some of the former prisoners, particularly the Japanese Americans who were there much longer than I, after I was there. So that sort of question comes up, and we had one discussion when they were there. We held some spontaneous meetings so that we could pick up information, what people were doing. Many of them had come from California. We had Heart Mountain Resistors Group present there, and Manzanar. So we had a good representation. Forest Division was just surprised. They're used to trees and four-legged animals and so on. So they didn't know how many people would show up, if any. And over 200 were there for that ceremony. So one of the questions that we discussed with some regret that it was a discussion issue, and it took a lot of emotion and time of all sides, was the issue of, you know, should they apologize, should JACL apologize for calling them, you know, disloyal and that sort of thing during the war? Or should they be, should these people be called respected objectors? Some things that are useful took place and led by Hawaii veterans, Nisei veterans groups in Hawaii. Their chapters recommended that all persons who made conscientious decisions should be respected for what they were doing for good cause, and we shouldn't waste a lot of energy battling among ourselves. We got other problems that we could save that energy for. And that's the kind of feeling that came out of that discussion. Anybody comment on that? Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Can you give us your name?
Harvey Watanabe. I met Gordon quite a few years ago at Auburn High School. I think if we would, as a society, and we're getting better at it, would do less and less towards creating a society that is like a hive of bees. We are a society of individuals, and as such, we should, to a much greater degree, honor the decisions that individuals make. And that is my viewpoint, and I think there is, in the case of the Nono boys, I think they did a wonderful thing. That's my opinion. And I hope I'm right. Thank you.
I'm Akio Yanagihara, and I'd like to ask Gordon, those of us in the Japanese community know your story, but I've mentioned to Densho people and others what about your family? What did they go through during your time of incarceration later? I mentioned this to Esther, and I'd like to get a hold of Dick to see if anyone, I know Esther's reluctant and Kim is reluctant, and I'd like to get a hold of Dick. Maybe he could articulate the family side. Not to be inquisitive, personally, but I think the community needs to know what your family went through at the time of your incarceration and after that.
I think I appreciate your question, and like other families, they went through a lot. I'd just like to mention one incident, because one experience they had relieved me of a big burden on my shoulder I didn't know I was carrying. They first were in our case, from Auburn to outside of Fresno, Pinedale Assembly Center, temporary camp, about 120 degrees if you found the shade, very hot for 2 months, and then transferred to Northern California, Tule Lake Camp. And when they were unpacking, somebody knocked on the door, and my mother opened it, and there were two ladies who had walked from the first barracks. They were the first ones in out of, what's that fishing island in Los Angeles Harbor? Terminal Island, yeah. They were the first ones to move, just like Bainbridge was one of the early ones to move up in Washington area because of nearness to military headquarters. They came over and they said, we heard that parents of the guy in Seattle fighting our case are arriving. So we came out, it's about 1.5 miles to the other end, but we wanted to come and first of all welcome you to the camp, and to say thank you for your son. And my mother wrote weekly letters to me, about a half a page, typewriter size page. There's a Japanese tablet just exactly that size with lines. She would write me katakana, that's that simple phrasing Japanese letter script that I could still read. And she would write what's going on in the family, and to this day, I don't know how many times I felt like shooting myself. I don't know where those letters are. I lost them somewhere. They would be golden letters to have as a special kind of memento, not of them only for us, but of one of those parent picture would answer some of the questions you were raising there. One time she asked me, "My, your Japanese improved. What's going on?" And I said, "Well, they found a Japanese alien way out in the woods who was working in sawmill. He didn't know that there was a movement, and so he was out there, and since he's in an isolated area, he never learned much English. So I had to talk with difficulty all kinds of things, and increasing my vocabulary in the process so that I didn't realize it, but she saw lots of words that I never had before coming in the letter. But when she wrote that, when she said, I got a big lift out of that visit when they said, "Thanks for your son." And when I read that, a big weight left my shoulders. I didn't know I was carrying that, but I felt kind of guilty as a son turning down my parents' request. They had surprised me I didn't realize they had such a strong pacifist background in their non-church movement. And they said, we agree with what you say, and we are proud that you could think like that even in this crisis. But this is war, and if the government could do this sort of thing to us, they could keep us separated forever. And so we got to stick together, and we don't know where we're going, nor for how long. So come home, and eventually, in tears. I think of all the, the emotional experience, that was one of the hardest to confront. And so I guess I was carrying this weight, which left with that letter, because I knew standing next to her, she couldn't have gotten that same lift as she did with talking with these two ladies.
I'd like to thank Mr. Watanabe for that good question, and thank you, Gordon. I'd like to thank you for participating in this program. It's indeed been an inspiring afternoon with very much to think about. Thank Gordon for reminding us that we must be ever vigilant to protect and defend our constitutional and human rights. And in a time of crisis, we must be willing to take a stand, guided by our ideals and principles. And as Gordon has said, and shown by his own actions, that idealism is realism, that individuals in that moment of crisis took many different stands based on their own principles and on their own beliefs, that we must indeed, as the audience has agreed, respect those personal, private decisions with all the consequences that followed. I think I'd like to end with a moment of silence, just a short moment of silence, to remember Executive Order 9066, the living and the dead who survived and didn't survive, I suppose, the consequences, who suffered the consequences of Executive Order 9066, and the many people whose lives thereafter have helped, I think, our nation to protect and implement the ideals that we all, I think, believe in. And people like Gordon, men that fought in the war, those that were conscientious objectors, and those that made their own other pathways and decisions. So please take a moment now of silence to remember those many lives. Thank you very much. And we'll see you at the Winglook Asian Museum for the reception. Thank you, Gordon.